Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 426, and my guest is Matthew Krayton. Matthew's episode is quite timely, as he's a political strategist, digital age expert, and founder of Publitix, which builds campaigns at the local, state, and federal levels in both private and public sectors. We discuss the weird and wild ride of American politics, the complications of social media, and trying to connect to a populace who feel adrift and are as easily swayed by untruths as they are truths. Incredibly fascinating conversation. It went on for a while. I took up so much of his time, and he was so gracious about it because I know he is incredibly busy right now. And it was really, really fascinating. We actually had this conversation pre both assassination attempts at this point. And so we don't discuss that at all because it had not yet happened. My intent was to save this episode to closer to the election time, and I was going to have Matthew come back on and talk a little bit about how what happened might be shaping things, or even up to date as what's going on now, just in general with the election. And he's just so busy, so we didn't get a chance to reconnect. But I think this is a really interesting, great episode, and I think you will learn a lot. I know I did. General Stuff, Hey Human Podcast is now on YouTube under Official Susan Ruth. I'm on Patreon at Susan Ruthism, where you can help support Hey Human, keep it ad-free. TikTok, I am there, Susan Ruthism, and check out heyhumanpodcast.com for links and to learn more about my guests on the show. Check out susanruth.com to learn more about me and my other artistic endeavors, and follow Susan Ruthism on social media. The evil social media. We all hate it, but we all need it, right? Find my albums on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your music. Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Please register to vote. You can go to vote.org. That's vote.org if you are eligible to vote. Please do so. Please, please. It's really important. So do that. Be kind. Be well. Be love. Here we go. Matthew Krayton, welcome to Hey Human.
Thank you for having me.
It's lovely to see you.
Great to see you as well.
Where are you hailing from?
So I am sitting in New Jersey right now, from New Jersey as well. So
okay, the Garden State.
North Jersey, yep.
Yeah.
I'm bred, proud of it. Proud New Jerseyan.
I've been to Jersey on a lake boating around, and I thought, yeah, I get it. It was gorgeous.
Well, yeah, for those listening who have not yet had the opportunity to visit New Jersey, we do have lakes, and they are beautiful. We also have mountains and beautiful beaches, so I recommend definitely visit. It's not all the turnpike. I mean, that's something that I've always said about Jersey in particular, is that unfortunately, if you fly into Jersey, you're flying into the Newark airport, which is like right on the turnpike. You see all the stuff going on at the port down there, which is absolutely essential. But I think that's the impression people get of our state. So we do have lakes, I promise, and nature and beautiful little downtowns and things like that. So worth a visit. So this is my little pitch for Jersey tourism. Absolutely.
And my audience can't see you, but the muscle shirt you're wearing is awesome. Just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. I've got my hair slicked back. The pump going. Yeah. That's the look.
It is. You don't have a Jersey accent at all, to my ear at least.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I had a few years ago an Uber driver in Washington D.C. when I was down there for a couple of meetings, and she was able to pick it out. So she was like, "Oh, you must be from New Jersey." I'm like, "Oh, I didn't think I had that thick of an accent," but it does run the spectrum. Actually, I should say there is no single Jersey accent in the southern half of the state. It's very much sort of a Philadelphia sounding accent, south of, I don't know, 195. North of that, you get the spectrum of sort of New York, or a lot of people sound like me, Central Jersey. I mean, now we're getting into like hot debate territory here about like whether or not Central Jersey exists, but it's, more of a neutral type thing. But that Uber driver she picked me out. She was like, "Oh, you sound like you're from Jersey." I'm like, "Well,
That's probably because the Uber driver was East Coast. I feel like I can tell people, because I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, I can tell people Canadian, or even if it's a slight Canadian accent, or Oregon, it's a little different, that it's weird. I think if you're from the region, you pick up stuff a little bit more.
Yeah, you definitely are attuned to it. I mean, accents are fascinating to me. I know I could go on for like hours, but it is fascinating. Even within like certain communities or neighborhoods in certain parts of Jersey, you get some very interesting sort of linguistic things that you hear from people. So it's like, like Hudson County, for example, which is very close to New York City. Like if you're like old Hudson County, like there are certain little verbal quirks that you hear, like adding an R on the end of words that have an A at the end. So like idea turns into idea, or pizza, or like it's very, and you only hear that in very specific areas. So it's not like it's really interesting to hear. Whereas like if you go a mile, a different direction, it's more of a standard sound. So it's kind of like cool to see the spectrum of things and how language is developed.
Absolutely. And I myself, I lived in the South for 13 years. And when I go there, I find that it doesn't take very long before my lilt comes in. I mean, I wasn't born there or anything, but I start to adapt to what's around me.
Oh yeah, you definitely do hear that quite a bit, where people start to mirror the accent. So in college, I had a roommate actually from South Jersey, and he had a very thick sort of Philadelphia kind of accent. And you start to hear yourself saying, like, you spend enough time and you start hearing yourself saying like things like home, phone, like the O sound, which is a very like Philly kind of thing. So it's definitely an interesting thing. I've seen that happen before. People come up here and their accents, fade a little bit from the South. I have a neighbor, she's from Alabama. You could hear it a little bit, but it's not super thick, right? Like I think it's definitely tamped down. But then you go home for a week, like you said, and you really start to hear it again. So
what's so interesting about it is that on a brain level, that it just shows how much human beings want to connect to another, that we will go into that sort of a mirroring and try to match up our intonations and our vocal pitches and things like that. I just think that's so fascinating. It just says how tribal we are.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's definitely a whole area of study that I think I would be interested actually in going back into, if I had a lot of free time. I think, linguistics and patterns of speech and things like that would be very interesting. I mean, like peripherally, and, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about it, but peripherally, we think a lot about how to communicate in certain situations and how to connect with people. Linguistics is a very, very deep well, and I would certainly be interested in exploring it, if I have some free time. So maybe that'll be my next act, is going and studying some of that stuff.
Yeah, I love it. Follow your bliss, for sure. Well, let's talk about we know where you grew up. I'm assuming you did grow up there. Tell me about what shaped you as a person as you were growing up and started you down the funnel of what you do now.
That's a really fascinating question. So it was sort of a pretty standard, like suburban New Jersey upbringing. Nothing exceptional. I would say, went to public schools, had the benefit of living in a place that had a really great education system, a place that provides a lot of opportunities, even if you don't know it at the time, when you're a little kid, student in high school, middle school. I will say that I was not the best student in high school, middle school, so I definitely had my challenges with traditional school, things that I was interested in. Obviously, I excelled at. Things that I wasn't particularly interested in, I struggled or kind of shrugged off or didn't pay too much attention to, didn't, put a whole lot of effort in. So I had a lot of advantages, though, obviously, growing up where I did and having the sort of winning the lottery of just having been born into a place on the globe, which in the grand scheme of things is really just like a little pinpoint on a map. So I just, I went through school, never really had a sense of what I wanted to do necessarily. As I kind of went through high school, you go through phases, thinking, oh, maybe I'll do this, do that. But I thought, at the end of high school, you know what, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to try to get into teaching, which was interesting. So because I wasn't particularly as focused as I perhaps should have been in school, I thought, why don't I become a teacher? Because then people like me, I can try to recreate things or teach in a way that's engaging to people like me who don't really find all that much interest in certain topics or relevance. So ended up getting into a couple of colleges. Went to a school in Jersey called Fairleigh Dickinson, which is not very well known, except for the fact that we made a really brief run at the NCAA basketball tournament. I think it was last year, and had a little bit of a Cinderella run. It didn't go on for very long, but there were some exciting games in there, and that was cool. So that sort of raised the profile of the school, which is always fun because we're not a sports school. So I went there, studied history, political science, thought I was going to be a teacher the whole time, and then 2008 came around, economy collapsed. So I like to say it's sort of a very millennial story from this point till present. Economy collapsed. I ended up graduating in 2010 with my bachelor's, 2011 with a master's degree in education, did my student teaching, did all of that, but there still weren't that many jobs out there. So in New Jersey, public education budgets were gutted under the governor at the time, due to some of the financial hardships. And then also there's some like political stuff that led to, the cutting of education budgets. So what ended up happening was, I was applying for jobs. There were hundreds of other applicants in some cases. Many of them had 7 years of experience. Why would they hire some kid, especially with a master's degree, because that makes you a little bit more expensive. So why would you hire some kid out of college that's more expensive, less experience than if you could hire someone who's got 7 years of, or 7 years of classroom experience? So that kind of triggered the, what do I do with my life? So I always thought I was interested in politics. That was always something that was interesting to me. During my graduate school years, I actually did a graduate assistantship at a public opinion polling institute called Public Mind Poll. Learned a lot of really cool things about public opinion, how people think about specific issues, specific elected officials, politicians, policies. So that was a lot of fun, but didn't really do much of anything with that for a couple years. So I naturally just took the first job that came my way, which happened to be doing some fundraising and alumni relations at the school that I was at, and specifically geared toward young alums. As you can imagine, they hired me and then one other person from a second. So there were 2 campuses in New Jersey. They wanted to have representation from both. So they hired 2 of us. And our charge was sort of to connect with young alums, call through the phone book essentially and ask for money. As you can imagine, in that economic climate, people were not thrilled to hear from me and had a lot of creative ways of rebuffing my ask. So, and certainly many of those responses are not appropriate to repeat here or anywhere for that matter. And I understood it, right? And I asked myself, well, if someone called me and asked for money at this point, there people have student loans, the job prospects were a little dicey at the moment. So it was, I got it. I understood it. But needless to say, the expectations were completely mismatched. So, we ended up getting laid off 10 months later. And I was like, we're right back in the mix again. So I figured, why don't I try to start my own thing? I've always liked the politics. So let me try to work on a couple of campaigns. So I went out and found 2 campaigns. One was a local campaign. One was a campaign for Congress. And I purposely looked for at least a campaign that wouldn't have a very good chance of winning, because the ones that do are pretty much spoken for in terms of who does what on those campaigns. The ones that have nothing to lose are more likely to take a risk on someone that doesn't have any experience and maybe would be willing to experiment a little bit with the different methods of communication. So at the time, I was like, well, I'm young. What are they going to trust me to do? So I was like, I'll tell them I do social media. I will do their social media, their digital. So I did the pitch. They're like, you're young. You must know how to use Facebook. I'm like, yep, I definitely do. So then, I had to teach myself all this
stuff. Are you friends with Tom from MySpace?
Yes. Yep. That was so funny, because that was sort of we were moving just beyond the MySpace era at that point. And, but knowing Tom, or who Tom was, being able to identify that, I think was very useful in my in my endeavors. And then, in 2012, right? So like Facebook became a huge thing in the Obama reelection campaign. So like social media started to kind of take root in some of the digital media stuff in the 2008 campaign, but 2012 it really came into its own as sort of a medium for communication, took kind of center stage. So I had the opportunity to kind of get in and say like, well, I grew up with this stuff. Like as I was graduating high school, that's when Facebook was starting to get rolled out to people who had, I'm really dating myself now, who had access to a university email address. So this is before Facebook was available to everyone. It was just, you had to have a college email address. Now, prior to that, I think it was only like Ivy League schools, you could get in. So, but then, it was sort of like in that expansion era of Facebook. So yeah, that's sort of how I ended up where I am today is, just kept doing it and have been fortunate to learn a lot, and to have people in my life who have been extraordinarily helpful mentors and generous mentors with their time and knowledge, and kept going, and now have had the opportunity to do a lot of cool stuff in my career.
Was that the founding of your company, or did that come a little later?
It was. So in 2011, I technically incorporated, and I was like, all right, I'm going to give this a shot. And 2012 were the first two races that I ended up doing. And we actually ended up winning one of them, which is the local race, which is a little bit of a surprise. I didn't think we were going to. We ended up winning, and then that created a situation where I was able to network a bit and meet different people, and just kind of kept going, meeting new people. I met my business partner in 2014, a few years later when we were working on a campaign together. And we've been growing ever since. So it's been a little bit of luck, a little bit of, just determination and not letting, a couple close calls, I guess, knock us down in terms of like mistakes that you make along the way. But learned a lot of lessons the hard way for sure.
What's an example of a close call?
One of the first things that we ever did, or I ever did at that point, that was sort of just a solo act. We produced a television ad. Looking back, kind of an insane thing to do. So the idea was to air a single ad, so one 30-second spot. That's all the campaign could afford on a very obscure local access TV station that didn't even cover the area that we were running in, but the candidate happened to know someone at the network, and they were going to carry a debate between him and his opponent. So they were like, let's just run this one ad during the debate. It's going to crack this whole thing open, and we're going to move numbers and move people to vote. I'm like, well, no one in New Jersey actually watches this television station because it covers like sort of Westchester County, Rockland County in New York. Like no one around here watches it. So we ended up producing this ad and spent our own money out of pocket with the production crew to produce the ad. And then the campaign just refused to pay. So this was like sort of a wake up call in business. You always get paid up front, for stuff that you're out of pocket on. But instead of telling our production partners that they would also be out the money. I went into my savings and paid them for their services because I think I just think it's wrong to stiff people. And it was my responsibility. I brought them in, and they had the understanding that they were going to get paid. So I had to go into my savings and pretty much took it to zero to pay them. From that moment on, it was like, okay, we're not going to do that again. So we will have safeguards in place and things. So that was a close call. You just make other minor mistakes along the way as well. And you just learn things about business. If you've never run one, that's unfortunately the hardest way to learn, but I think probably one of the better ways to. I mean, you can tell someone all day in a classroom, how to run a business, but once you're in the room and you're responsible for all of the operations and everything, it takes on a totally different form. So, so that was, my first big sort of shock, and didn't kill us, which was good. And we were able to, we've been able to, continue on from there. So
unfortunately, it's not an uncommon story that people get taken advantage of and lose a shit ton of money in the process. I think that's happened to pretty much everyone I know, including myself, while trying to make your business fly.
It is. Yeah. I mean, I really hate that behavior, right? Because if you contract with someone and you have an understanding, like I understand that things happen along the way that might make it so, paying a vendor or paying a service provider would be difficult, but I think you would need to have those, transparent conversations up front. But you do see it too often, especially with like a lot of small businesses. You hear about horror stories where they just get abused by much larger businesses, or, someone will come back and try to go back to the well and say, you know what, why don't you cut your bill in half, and that's as good as you're going to do, or sue me and you'll be in court forever. Like, you see that too often. It's really, it's sad. It's sad to see, but it does happen. And I think there's just this sort of misconception in business that you have to be that kind of, like, that sort of smart behavior. It's not unethical. It's just smart business. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I think relationships are very important, and you're not going to maintain any sort of meaningful relationship by doing that sort of thing to another human being. So anyway, that's
also word gets out.
It does. You run out of places to turn eventually, and you just can't do that sort of thing. I mean, you can, but it all catches up. So in the short term, might work out for you, but in the long term, I just don't think so. It is, to your point, like, all too prevalent and very hard to watch, but we just do the best we can.
Yeah, for sure. And we haven't yet mentioned your company, Publitix. Am I saying it right? You
got it. You nailed it. Yes. For sure. It was good. Excellent.
Excellent. It's interesting how much everything, I mean, actually, it's not just interesting. I think it's slightly devastating how much is done online in terms of politics, because as much as the truth can be told, the lies can be told, and the lies tend to be louder. And it's very hard to fight that. And there are powers that be that are spending God knows how much money to flood our social media with bullshit, basically. So how does one fight that?
I'm really glad that you said that. So there are a lot of issues, right? So a lot of what is built into these platforms from an algorithmic perspective, it rewards what I call like activating emotions. So like anger is an activating emotion. So if you see something that makes you angry, you're much more likely to share it. Same thing with surprise. If you're surprised by something, you're much more likely to share it with your friends. So those things spread. So, the algorithms, and each of the platforms are a little bit different depending upon, which platform you're talking about, but like likes, shares, all of those things, comments, for example. The more of those things that happen organically, the more it gets boosted up in the algorithm, then the more people that see it, then the more people that interact. So it's sort of like a cycle that self-perpetuates after, the first interaction. So that's the unfortunate part, is that things that tend to make you just happy or content, they're not really activating emotions, right? So you might be happy in seeing it, but you're not very likely to share it. But you are much more likely to sort of rage share, right? Like, oh, this makes me so angry, so I'm going to smash the share button and share it to my friends, and it's going to generate all sorts of comments. Now, the things that tend to make us angry, unfortunately, a lot of those things are disinformation, which are crafted intentionally to tap into that very cycle. The algorithm, it games the algorithm, and it's a scary thing, because you are so much information that's false, or even misframing of information, or expectation setting is furnished to people who, and by people, I mean, like, we as a society, the evolution of social media took place so quickly, and is still evolving so quickly, that the sort of public education with how to engage with these platforms and how to evaluate the information that you see on there it wasn't able to keep up, right? Like, there just isn't. When I was growing up, when I was in high school, for example, MySpace was a big thing, though not as algorithmically driven as like a Facebook. But, once we all got in Facebook, that was a big, once they introduced the news feed and the like buttons and different colors and things like that, to promote sharing and engagement, that became very algorithmically driven. We never had like a media literacy class. You did your history, social studies, you did your math, you did your language classes, English, literature, all of those things. You did type, you learned how to type. I remember learning to to type and get off this sort of hunt and peck, method. So that was the extent of it, though. That was the extent of the education that we have. Nothing prepared us for how to evaluate information that we were presented with on the internet, and how to, other than like a couple stern warnings about Wikipedia, right? That was like, oh, you can't source this paper from Wikipedia because like you just never know what's on there. That was it. That was it. That was the only thing that you ever heard. And the sort of social media was able to catch momentum in a way that the rest of we just didn't have context for how to evaluate some of this stuff. Now I think we're starting to realize like what happens when you don't have the context for evaluating certain information. And I think you're seeing an increased conversation about the potential harms that social media can do in a number of ways. It's not just politically, but also from a mental health perspective. I mean, I don't think it was very well understood at all what sort of impact you would be faced with. But even now, I see certain content that the algorithm wants me to see. I'm lucky in that, like, I work in this space, like I have a little bit of context for how to evaluate certain things that I'm seeing. But for someone who doesn't have that context, you're seeing some of these things, and it's scary because it sets an expectation for life that is oftentimes completely unattainable, and all in service of selling you something, whatever it is, like a course or selling some sort of kind of like expertise or like mastermind or whatever. Like you see a lot of these business gurus, for example. Something actually I've been thinking a lot. I know this is kind of taking it down a little bit of a tangent, but something I've been thinking a lot about too is like how young men in particular consume social media. So like I know young women have a lot of challenges as they look through social media. That should be absolutely like 100% top of mind. But young men also are being presented with things that are harmful in a slightly different way. So like I'll give you a good example of this. So if you're a young man, and this is actually like real content that I've seen, so hopefully I don't get like hate for what I'm about to say. Maybe I will. I don't know. That'll drive some engagement for you. How's that? So we'll get the engagement up by driving some hate. But I saw a clip, unironically. I don't even know who it was. It was some person on a podcast, much like I'm talking to you right now, and with a straight face said, if you're 25 years old and you haven't purchased a Lamborghini yet.
I saw that guy.
See that guy? Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Like, do you know how many Lamborghinis are sold in the US every year?
I mean, it's just so, I thought, is this a joke? I couldn't tell if he was being ironic, if it was satire or what was happening.
I don't think it was. I don't think it was.
No, I don't think it was.
It's scary though. Like, and the fact that we have to wonder if it was satire is kind of, that's the point, right?
Life is so insane at this point that you think it's the whole of humanity is being written by the Onion.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's like one big Onion headline after another. But
it's real. It's so
I think the writers' room is actually maybe they're running the show, right? The Onion writers' room. They've got the whole thing, feeding it into a machine or something.
Exactly.
But you see stuff like that, right? And if you're a young man who feels like he cannot get traction in life, and or perhaps like you are getting some traction, but it's not Lamborghini level traction. Again, like how many Lamborghinis?
The Honda Civic.
Yeah, God forbid, right? Like, I mean, like I drove like a Ford Fusion, that didn't have air conditioning for a couple years, after college, you know what I mean? It's like, that's life, right? And
that is life. Yeah.
Would a Lamborghini that had air conditioning have been nice? Sure, if someone wanted to give it to me, but there was no way that like any person could afford it. But I mean, for perspective, I mean, I think it's like something like 100 or so are sold every year, and the number that are sold to 25-year-olds is probably vanishingly small, if not zero.
It may be the influencers who tend to be younger, but yeah, I mean, I totally am right there with you. It creates a false narrative that then in turn creates a toxicity that's probably pretty hard to override in a society across the board in general that struggles with self-worth and self-loathing and all of that.
Yeah. I mean, if someone tells you like you can have this thing if you just try hard enough, and then you try hard and then you can't have that thing because it's actually insane, you're going to start to develop a sense of resentment. And that resentment doesn't oftentimes, you're not pointing it inward, then you start to point it outward. You start to ask yourself, well, I should be able to get ahead. I've been told that I should be able to get these things without much effort or extraordinary sort of effort to do so. It can't be me. What's wrong with society?
Right.
What's wrong with this system? And then you start pointing fingers at other things. So then you hear about programs and initiatives that are meant to level the playing field after, the history full of inequities in our society, right? Like it's all a process toward developing a more level playing field. And you start to see those things and you start to go, well, that's not fair. All these people are getting help that I'm not. And I should be able to do these things. So like, I'm going to get really mad and I'm going to, vote in a particular way or act out in a violent way in the worst cases, which is very scary. Like the amount of sort of politically driven or socially driven sort of violent pronouncements and ultimately behavior in some ways is.
Yeah. Doxing. I can't even imagine how much that has increased over the years, but it's got to be by large percentages.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that and physical violence in the world where people are showing up to protests with guns and firing on people.
It's violence against women because your woman is supposed to be a pure, clean slate and she can't have what they call a body count. You got to wonder, too, the mastermind behind it all. Or are we just undoing ourselves for the sake of the fact that our brains react to hate and violence now in the same way as the little cocaine pellet does for the mice in the maze?
I mean, some of this is just tapping into sort of like deep-seated evolutionary leftovers, in our brain, stuff that we like don't even necessarily need anymore. But just exists because, we had to defend ourselves against, warfare. I mean, like, human beings are tribal by nature, right? Like you group into tribes and identify out groups and threats and, going all the way back to when, you used to have to run away from, saber-toothed tigers while you're trying to like hunt and gather berries, like in the forest. So it's like, I mean, that's obviously like a little anachronistic there, but but the point being is like there are a lot of sort of areas that evolutionarily like we sort of developed these mechanisms because it led to our survival as a species. But like now we have an increasingly connected, for better or for worse, world, and there's some reasons why it's better because we're connected and able to learn more and connect more with people in different parts of the world and get information out there. But there's also a downside to that too, because we haven't totally shed those sort of bad sort of habits that exist within us. So it's, again, which is why anger is such an activating emotion, because if anger doesn't activate you to do something, then there is no evolutionary purpose for being angry, right? There's no reason to have that around anymore. So it's sort of an interesting thing. Like, if again, I think, you're sort of part of a hunter-gatherer society and you needed anxiety, for example, or anger, like all of those things function to get you to move, to do something in the face of a profound threat to your life or your tribal or your group's life, whatever sort of group you were in. So it's definitely an interesting thing how that translates to a world where we are very connected. We do have access to social media. A lot of people have a platform now that if you have a microphone like the one I'm sitting in front of and a pair of headphones and a computer and a webcam, you can you have a platform essentially in a way that you wouldn't have had before. You used to have to go. There used to be some filter, right? Like if you think about the news, right, and the role that journalism played in certain circumstances, like Cronkite, for example, right? Like it was all filtered through that, and some random person wouldn't just go on Cronkite because they were just a random person who had some idea thing. It was usually there was some vetting that went on related to the information that was going to be relayed in whatever interview. So so now we all have, a phone. If you have a phone, right, you can jump on TikTok and do something and go viral and all of a sudden become famous. I mean, you see it with like viral, like celebrity, people who have just like a random moment on an interview somewhere on someone else's channel. And then all of a sudden they become.
Yeah. They get signed to agencies and they go on talk shows and.
Yeah. And it's interesting.
It's a Black Mirror episode. And I wonder, I mean, certainly there are powerful people that love to see the chaos because it's pretty easy to control people when they're being chaotic. But I'm wondering if the pendulum will swing back and we will get placated somehow. The only way I can see it now logically is if something were to destroy the internet. But again, to your point, it's hard because thanks to the internet, we've been able to see injustices or bring down regimes that were horrific or just get the word out about important issues or fundraise for the Smiths whose house burned down, whatever it is. Obviously, it can be used for good. As much as we are horrifying to each other at times, our sense of altruism and goodness also rises to the occasion. I'm not sure, me personally, Susan, I'm not sure why it feels like the negativity is so much more popular. Like people just love to be pissed. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if there's an antidote to that or if it's just that loud people who are angry are louder. Yeah, I don't know.
Some element of that, where you do have, I would say the majority of people are not tuned in enough for them to be that angry about whatever given thing. Like, so this is interesting because it does filter down to even like the local level. So like we have, every town I feel like in America has like a dedicated Facebook group, that people sort or next door,
which is insane.
I stay off the next door stuff.
Oh my God, it's so crazy.
It's hard to watch, but even the Facebook groups, right? So we have one in town, and there was a restaurant down on the main drag, a little bit, a few miles from where we are, and their landscaper just didn't show up, for a week, and the grass was getting a little long in front, and someone decided to take to this Facebook group to absolutely, lecture this business owner on the fact that their grass was getting so long. It was, an abomination, to the town. You would have thought that this person, the business owner, the restaurant owner, committed some sort of atrocity, but you feel terrible. And it was probably 300 comments deep, most of them very negative. And, eventually at the end, I guess someone let him know that this was happening. And, he got in there and he's like, I am so sorry. My landscaper, just couldn't make it this week. I'm going to go out and buy a lawnmower and take care of it myself. We've just been really busy. And it's like, you don't know what's going on in that person's life. Like, it's not near I promise you, there's no one lives like across the street from this restaurant. It's not even like you have to look at it. You drive by it, like just let it go. But there is like this instinct to say something negative, even at that level. It's not, we're not talking about issues of national importance now. We're talking about grass a little bit too long.
And the fact that someone would be compelled, or 300 people would be compelled to complain about it, and not one of those people thought, you know what, I have a lawnmower. I'm just going to go spend an hour and cut this grass because, it's the nice thing to do. That our proclivities don't lead in that direction is a real freaking bummer to me. And I worry because as we get more and more humans on this planet who have not the skill set to fight that urge, I understand that reptilian brains, I get that. But we have evolved as a species, mostly, that you would think that we would not. It's speaking to a bigger problem. I think that we're using this, as you said, as this outlet for a rage or a discontent that we don't even know how to touch. And all we can do is aim it outward and attack because it's the easiest thing in the world to do.
It is. And I think part of it too is it just simplifies everything. There's good and there's bad. And that's it. And, there's a lot of gray area. Now, I think that there are things that are mostly good. and mostly bad? Absolutely. And there are objectively, in my opinion, objectively things that are good and bad, right? But for most issues, there is a lot of nuance, a lot of imperfection in how one might deal with a particular issue, but that's not very satisfying, right? Nuance is hard. Nuance takes work, and anger, and creating sort of this black and white, sort of binary of, yes or no. I think that just simplifies things the things that don't need to be simplified. And again, I think there are simple choices and simple contrasts in certain circumstances, but most things in life, there is a vast gulf of gray area, nuance, of understanding that needs to happen, before you jump in. So I do think there is some element of that, of like, okay, how can we just like simplify this and like to figure out how to manage this issue? It's like, okay, I'm going to be angry at this, and then that's it. That's simple, easy.
Yeah, well, it seems like in politics that there is one side who definitely understands the inclination to inflame, and that can be an advantage. And then there's another side that doesn't seem to want to engage that obvious thing. And I'm curious to see what your thoughts are of how that would play out. When you go high, if they're just always going low, what do you do in that scenario? Especially for somebody like you, whose job it is to help elect someone.
Sure, absolutely. So I think, and you're going to get a real sense of where my political leanings are. It's
a tricky thing to ask, right? Because I know I have a feeling we're both on the same page politically, but this question, this is what frustrates me about this country. The question I'm asking isn't really it's not about party. It's about just the convulsions that people have towards something, and the way they operate in general. Like we talked about in the beginning, the people who decide they're going to pay for something or not pay for something. Now, do you know what I mean? Like it's hard to ask a question like this because immediately someone's like, oh, that's a political thing. You just hate all blah. I don't hate all anybody, but I can see what's happening.
Absolutely. So this is a conversation that I've, interestingly enough, have been having more in my personal life, because you're able to have those sort of nuanced conversations about things. So I think that whether you agree or disagree with, or I should say in the past tense, agreed or disagreed with how, for example, the Republican Party was handling things, at least most of the time, you could have a pretty good sense that the people running for president in that party, running for office, not all of them, but most, had would adhere to the norms and standards and sort of democratic guardrails that exist in this country that enable us to have conversations, difficult political conversations, and allow us to change direction if the voters choose to change direction.
With integrity.
With integrity.
Yes.
With integrity. I mean, but relative in that.
Relatively, yeah.
Politics has always been ugly, right? Like if you look back at the Nixon years, right, they were all up to dirty tricks, and they had whole sort of little teams dedicated to doing nasty thing, and then unfortunately, a lot of those people are still kicking around Republican politics today. The Roger Stones of the world. I mean, he's got that big old Nixon tattoo on back tat, on the shoulder blade to shoulder blade, but. So like it's always been a little bit like that, but at the end of the day, you could always have some degree of confidence that the person in the White House, after their 8 years was up, or if they lost after 4 years, that they would move on and the next person would come in, and that they would, out of a love for this country and a hope that that the country succeeds genuinely. You may not agree with how the other side wants to get there, but at least a shared agreement that they want to see this country succeed would help the next person transition into office. And I think what we've seen since 2016 is a complete shattering of that basic norm. So we're not having this conversation anymore about from a policy perspective, right? And I think that if we cannot start, so this is where I get to, is like, if we cannot start from a place where both sides agree that elections matter, the results of the election should be adhered to, that fundamentally that we should strive to have as many people, many American citizens as possible participate in that political process, not silence voices, not make it harder for those people to participate, but expand and do whatever we can to get the most voices into the political process. Like, if we fundamentally cannot agree on that, then the one side that doesn't believe that people should have a voice, that doesn't believe that we should adhere to elections, I think we're having a completely different conversation now. We're not talking about politics anymore. We are talking about the existential threat to the fundamental fabric of this country. And I think the way that we talk about democracy in general is maybe a little flawed, right? Because I think there is a fair case to make that when you say, well, we have to protect democracy, that there are a lot of people in this country, a lot of groups of people who have not been well served by our institutions historically, right? Our institutions, they're imperfect, right? That there have been a lot of injustices in this country. So when you say we want to protect democracy, just as sort of a blanket statement, they feel as if you're protecting a system that fundamentally doesn't work for them and hasn't ever worked for them. But really what it is, in my mind, what democracy is protecting our ability to continue to improve the system that we have, to continue to make the changes that we need to make, to continue to level the playing field, to continue to create an economy that works for a greater number of people in this country, right? It's like the capacity of democracy. When I think that's what we have to talk about when we talk about democracy, is protecting that capacity for people, every day, hardworking Americans, to have their voice heard in that process. And if you get rid of elections and you get rid of the guardrails and you make it okay to fundamentally influence our political process by brute force and violence, you are taking away those voices. And then who wins in that case, right? Whose voices are heard in that system? It's not going to be the hardworking Americans. It's not going to be people who want to see more progress on affordability and housing. It's not going to be people who have benefited from recent investments in cleaning up drinking water. It's not going to be the people who rely on insulin and have had those prices capped in this past administration, in the current administration, the Biden administration. So, like, you're just not going to have the capacity to fundamentally improve the system. Like, and I think it gets this idea of like burning it down. Like, if we burn it down, well, that sword cuts both ways, right? Like, people that are likely to rebuild the system are going to rebuild it in an image that you do not like not you. No,
I know what you mean. The royal you, we the people,
right? And so that's what I mean when I say like protecting democracy. It's protecting our capacity to continue to make progress while acknowledging that these institutions, they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they do serve a purpose of making sure that one particular person's ambitions cannot override the entire will of the people. That is the position that we're in now, unfortunately, is that we have a stark contrast between the two sides, where you have one side that fundamentally does not believe in preserving that capacity. In fact, they believe in completely tearing it apart and ripping it up and walling it off, and creating a system where only a few have an actual voice in the system. And I'm not saying it's perfect right now, but it's way better than what you would have in a system where, again, you're eliminating people's right to vote in this country. That's not good.
I know. I saw something on Facebook yesterday, a person in Tennessee that posted about ballot box that went in their neighborhood. And or maybe was it Tennessee? I think it was Tennessee. But they were all up in arms about it. And all I could think of is, why would you, if you were a patriot, truly, as people like to throw that word around, why would you not want to ensure that all citizens in our democracy make it easier for all citizens to vote. Why would you not want that? Now, I know why. It's because historically disenfranchised people tend to vote for a particular party over another, and therefore that they're not a voice that they want to lift up. But I can't help but keep going back to that saying that until all of us are free, none of us are free. And I don't know why so many of us work toward our own demise that can't see the writing on the wall of what it means to destroy democracy. It's like what you said about the guy talking about how if you don't have a Lamborghini, buy 25. Democracy takes work.
Yeah.
And most people don't even know anything about civics. They don't know who their representatives are, all the way down to the city level, all the way up the tree. And they don't really care. They just like yelling about it and don't know how some of these people are actively voting against their best interest, no matter which side of the political spectrum you're on, and that's what do you do with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. It kind of like brings the images up of some of these sort of like Republican members of Congress that would show up to the ribbon cuttings for big infrastructure projects that were funded by a law that they did not vote for. They like voted against it, right? And they show up for the ribbon cutting, going, "Oh, look at this brand new bridge that we are building that's going to connect two parts of this state or this city, and is going to create X amount of economic value and improve the quality of life, or we're going to be fixing the rails, or again, lead pipes, all that stuff." Like, they'll show up to these things and continue to get voted in by the people in those communities, while simultaneously the folks in those communities are very grateful for the new bridge, the new roads, the clean drinking water, the clean air, the new manufacturing jobs. I just saw a report. I need to read it more thoroughly, so I'm not going to throw numbers around, but sort of America is like left behind counties, right? The forgotten counties in America have done better in the last 4 years. Jobs, economic improvement, wage growth in these communities has been better in the last 4 years than they have been in the past several decades. And there is very real progress. If you look at the real wage growth, and I understand people are hurting, people are having a hard time with affordability, but the reality is wage growth among working class and middle class Americans has been greater under this presidency than it ever has before. The ability and desire to unionize in the last 4 years has been stronger than ever before. That means people have a voice in their workplace. They can get protection, basic protections, and negotiate with their employers. And you have an administration that's very supportive of all of that. And yet, if you ask people about all of those things, right, the majority of Americans, they like clean drinking water. They like the fact that drug companies cannot charge quite as much for insulin. They like the fact that we are trying to transition to clean energy for the most part. There's a little bit of, polarization in there too, but there are jobs that are associated with that as well. They like the fact that we are bringing manufacturing back to the United States, high-tech manufacturing that's going to provide jobs for people in these sort of left behind counties and other areas of the country as well. The problem is, once you attach a partisan label to it, they don't want anything to do with it. They don't care. It doesn't matter who did it. It's sort of that weird cognitive dissonance. And again, it kind of goes back, I think, to some of the externalization of personal, frustration with circumstances. And people do have challenges, right? And I think it would be tone deaf to say, like, well, look at all these things that are happening, you should be happy. That's not what anyone's saying, right? It's saying we are working together to make progress on these things. And the thing that enabled that was because people showed up and voted in 2020. And they voted again in 2022. We have a Democratic Senate. And again, you're getting a view of my sort of political leanings, but we have a Democratic Senate and a very closely divided House, Democratic president. Stuff is still getting done, because of those votes. We're able to accomplish those things. Now imagine a world where you don't get a vote, right? Or where your vote, you can vote, but then simply they just go, I don't like that vote, so we're going to toss that one out and count another one. Or we're going to find, 12,000 votes in Atlanta somewhere, or in Georgia somewhere, right? Like, how does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So it's a tough problem, and I think a lot of smart people are really trying to figure out what the answer to that is, because I think a lot of the conversations that we need to have do not lend themselves to mass media. So as a practitioner of politics, right, like these campaigns, they take place on a short timeline, like comparatively speaking. Now, I know this presidential cycle feels like it's longer than others because it is. It's going to be the longest general election cycle I think we've ever had. But still, that's not a super long time. There were several years preceding that where it was just the work of governing. And the work of governing doesn't really get a whole lot of clicks. It doesn't really get, our media landscape is totally fractured. So, local papers are not what they used to be. In fact, a lot of communities are what they call news deserts, right? They just don't have access to local news of any kind.
Yeah, and some of the major newspapers have now been compromised, unfortunately. So
100% gutted, sold off for parts. They have what used to be very robust, like state house bureaus in some of these places. They have maybe one reporter. They just borrow the AP's stuff, which, it's better than nothing, but you're not really penetrating. So then by the time you get to a campaign, it's like you got to figure out how to get the word out quickly and in a broad way. So it's like you have TV ads, you have direct mail, you do all the digital, you do videos, you do all of these things. But I think it requires a much more nuanced conversation with people, because the inclination, if you go up to someone who identifies as a Republican and you say, well, I'm a Democrat, the wall goes up immediately. You're not with me. I don't know. You believe stuff that I don't believe. An enemy, right? You were the wrong type of person. You are ruining this country. All that stuff. And I don't think that's the case. And again, we could go back to, I think at some point, like to your point about pendulum swinging back. Like I think we could get back to a place where we have a robust, hearty two-party system where we have legitimate debates about policy and how to implement that policy and how best to serve the country without having to worry about whether or not our entire ability, again, to have a voice in these conversations will disintegrate, right? Wouldn't it be great if we could just do that? But right now we have one party that's interested in the policy and the debate. And I would argue like the Democratic Party covers a very broad spectrum of policy beliefs at this point, where there is robust debate going on within the Democratic Party itself. The Republicans, though, by and large, not every one of them, there's some like Liz Cheney. Again, I've never thought, like, if you talk to young men, like Liz A. Cheney, right? But you know what? She put country before her political career and spoke out. Adam Kinzinger is another one, right? Put his country before his own political career. So you do see some, Mitt Romney, for example, same thing, spoke out and said, you know what, this is not good, but that is vanishingly small, as a small number of people that are willing to do that. And so what we have is a party apparatus. When I say the Republican Party, I'm not talking about Republican voters, because they are consuming the stuff that is coming to them from the leaders, but the leaders should know better, right? The leaders should make that commitment.
I think they do know better. That's the rub.
Some do, some I don't think, actually. Like now we're getting like a system where you actually have people getting into, especially some of these House seats that do actually, I don't think, know better.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, really scary stuff. So like you have the cynics, like I'm going to keep my seat. I'm going to lurch hard to the right and do the whole, Trump worship thing, for my political career. And it's all very calculated. And then you have some that are just simply like, I think they believe it genuinely, or they see it as a vehicle for getting done whatever, like super unpopular. The thing is, they don't like their own agenda too. Like if you read through the Project 2025 stuff, everyone's running away from that because they know it's super unpopular. But guess what? That's what they want to do.
That is what they want to do.
I don't know. It's a tough thing. I mean, because they know, I think they do know that it's unpopular, right? So that's why they're trying not to talk about that. They're trying to,
Right. They were hoping that would stay under the radar. And I think, true to your point, it's not about Republicans. It's about people who are in that political power.
Right.
Who I don't think are actually Republicans. I find it very hard to tag that name, because it means something different to me, I suppose. Over the years, I'm older, what it means to me versus what it is. This is two totally different things. It really
is. Like, I like know a lot of people who were Republicans, right? Like voters, like truly believed in the Republican party believed in certain elements of the platform when there still was like an actual platform that people could get behind. But since 2016 have taken a look at the party that they once felt like they belonged to and just said, what, I don't know what this is anymore. Like, this is not a thing. I'm gonna have to vote Democratic. Or some of them enthusiastically will say, like, I am gonna vote Democrat. And interestingly enough, too, like some Republicans that you talk to, former Republicans that you talk to, are more enthusiastic about voting this year than avowed Democrats or independent voters. Like, you would expect the opposite to be true, but they, like, some of those people are most vociferously opposed to this sort of attempted dismantling of the system, the American system, the American experiment. Like, they are the ones that are most offended by this. And I think maybe there's a sense of betrayal there too. It's like, I've spent my life maybe even donating to this party, knocking doors for this party, talking to my neighbors about various candidates who ran as Republicans at one point. And I feel betrayed by this because this is fundamentally un-American, what's going on right now. So like, you do actually hear that, which is really interesting. And they wouldn't recognize. I mean, a lot of these people don't recognize it as what you would consider, or I would consider, like a Republican Party of like John McCain or
sure.
Remember that clip of him at the town hall, and that woman was like, "Oh, Obama's not American." He was like, "Yes, ma'am," and he loves this country, and we just disagree on stuff. I totally misquoted it, but that's sort of
I just watched that the other day. In fact, a woman said, "Oh, Obama is not even born here, and he's not American, and he's a terror." Basically, she was saying the bigoted stuff, and McCain said, "Ma'am, that's not true. We don't agree on some policies and its politics, but he's a good person and his family is a good family."
Yeah.
What happened to that? I feel like it's just all being run by bullies now. It's just that bully energy. Don't like it at all. I mean, I understand it.
I know it's hard. It's hard to swallow, though, isn't it?
It's hard to wrap my head around, even though I'm watching it play out in real time. And I mean, I've had people who I've known for a very long time who completely, I mean, I hate to say drank the Kool-Aid, but that's kind of what it is. And the things that they had said to me, about my beliefs or my wanting to lift up people who are historically unheard or disenfranchised. And I think, wow, like, we can disagree politically. That's okay. But now you're calling me names and saying all that. It's so bizarre. And that was, of course, 4 years ago. It's fascinating. It's so fascinating. And I wonder, so you teach kids, or I guess college kids. Yes, you're an instructor at an adjunct.
Yeah, for several semesters. I took a couple semesters off. Things are getting busy now.
But I am curious what the young people think about it all. And if you're noticing whether or not they are starting to turn their back a little bit on social media and what it all means.
So I can kind of answer this from two different perspectives. So both, just the anecdotal, having taught social media courses, and then also having done polling and research in the area of like what young voters are paying attention to, what sort of things, actually not just young voters, but young people in general are paying attention to online, how they feel about social media. And it's sort of interesting because you do see a little bit of like a love-hate relationship with social media, where it's like, I think some have this intuitive sense of like, this isn't great, but I also like it too. Like, I like some of it because it does trigger like an actual like chemical reaction in your brain when you're doing these things. I mean, that's why it all works, right? Otherwise, like it wouldn't work. That's why people, get hooked on different things. It's sort of this neurological process that happens. So I think like in some ways it's a little bit of love-hate. Like if you really start digging into it, and I think there's an initial, just anecdotally, hesitancy in that environment to really talk about how social media impacts you on a personal level, right? Like the student on the personal, like I tried to get into that because like what I was teaching was like social media strategy. like in a business context, really is how do you use social media to communicate with customers, to brand your business, all of those different things. But I made sure that I really wanted to cover sort of the ethics of social media as well, and the ethics of using it, and just so like they had a context walking out of there of like, here are all the tips and tricks to like get people's attention and to sell products and to brand and to do what you're going to do successfully.
It's all boobs.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But like also to have like an ethical perspective and to consider that before you go down certain paths, like to not essentially prey on people's like insecurities or prey on people's fears or whatever. So I think there's like a little bit of a hesitancy to talk about it sometimes, like, and then when you start like digging or pushing on it, it's like, yeah, I actually do feel a sense of anxiety when I consume certain types of content or social media, or I do feel a certain sense of inadequacy when I consume social media. And sometimes I feel like I do know that what I'm seeing isn't necessarily real, but it's hard in that moment to like put that aside, like to center yourself in that thought versus what you're seeing on the screen. Like, I think it's interesting, when you talk to students like that and really kind of dig and push, but you have to push and you have to dig to get there, because it's not something that comes to top of mind. Like, it's like, okay, take a minute and actually really reflect on how this is making you feel and how you engage with this content that you're engaging with. And once you start to like kind of scrape away at the layers, it's like they start to admit, I mean, I think we all know, like, I know that I probably spend more time on my phone than I should. Is that stopping me from spending time on my phone? I mean, not all the time. Like, I really do try to take a step back, because it does get a little, overwhelming sometimes, right? When you're just bombarded with stuff. But I mean, it's interesting. So you see this actually in different ways too. So like, if you ask people about like their trust in different social media platforms in managing their data or privacy or any other sort of, or their mental health, for example, there's a discrepancy between what they say, which is it's fairly low trust. Like, they don't actually trust these platforms very much, but they still use them, right? So it's not enough to push people off. Like, the behavior does not, the view does not translate to behavior when it comes to social media. So that's a really interesting thing that you see in like a lot of public opinion research and polls that we've done. You see a huge discrepancy between those two things. Like, do you still use it? It's like, well, yeah, like I don't trust it, but I use it. Like, I mean, I know that they're probably doing something with my data that like I wouldn't necessarily like if you lay out, that's another interesting thing too, is like you walk the students through how data is being used or how ads are being targeted. Like, before you get into a college class about that, you see the ads, right? Like, unless you're like digging into it yourself, that's all you're seeing. You're seeing the ads, and they're kind of creepily relevant for, it's like, oh, well.
I've thought things and not said them out loud and then seen an ad for it, because I know how it works. I know that whatever that led me to have that thought has been tracked. And so it anticipates even before that I'm going to want to see that, or that I've been thinking about it. Ugh, terrifying.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like so until you actually like dig into like, how does this all work? You just don't have a frame of reference for it. So then, then they start thinking in that frame, and it's like, oh, well, I don't love that. Like, I don't love the fact that my data is used this way, or that there is like, for all intents and purposes, sort of like a facsimile of a person like me that they create in order to target these things and figure out who responds to what and all of that. And that's all part of the business, obviously. And like, again, like, I'm a practitioner of communication, and social media is an important place to communicate, and you have to play by the rules or in the environment that you're given. But again, you don't see that behavior or that view of some of the practices or algorithmic sort of things translate into actual behavior. So that's another really interesting thing too. You see a lot of, people consuming influencer content as well. Like that, those people are becoming more important than, your run of the mill celebrities in some cases. Sometimes there's some overlap too.
I think that at this point, influencers may in fact be more famous than celebrity. And also AI influencers, and where people don't even know what they're looking at is an avatar. Mm-hmm. The prevalence of that is fascinating.
So that was some polling. Actually, we're going to release the results shortly. So I had the opportunity to present some of this at a conference in Washington D.C. a few weeks ago. But we did some survey work on AI and people's views of different AI tools and whether or not they would have greater or less trust in a particular politician or platform if they used an AI tool to convey things, or whether or not labeling things matters. And so, I mean, the big takeaway is, like, people hope and trust things more when you are transparent about labeling something that's AI. So, like, instead of trying to pass off like a chat bot, for example, or an AI avatar as like a real person, human being, and then you're found out, like, people are not going to like that deception. So labeling, I think, does help build trust in that space. Transparent is like, this is an AI chatbot, or this is an AI avatar of whatever, person, public figure. That being said, also, people don't have a lot of confidence in their own ability to identify AI generated content. Like, they know that it's very hard to spot some of this stuff because of the split second judgments that we're making, when we're looking at it. And right now, yeah, sure, there's some telltale things if you look really closely, especially at like the generative video or photos, right? Like, extra fingers on a hand, or like, I guess hands are really hard for AI to kind of craft in that way. But
ironically, hands are very hard for artists to paint. I think that's very interesting.
Oh, well, maybe it's just like us then. As people, right? It's sort of adopted a lot of our own, quirks. But I mean, I think, like, people just don't have faith, and I think rightly so, in their ability to identify these things, because, like, why would you? I mean, the voice related AI, generative AI is pretty scary because there's nothing to look at. I mean, you can hear intonations that are a little bit different or off. Like, if you really know someone and have heard their voice before, you could probably tell. But if you only hear their voice occasionally, and then you hear some AI clone of their voice, it's going to be very hard to figure out exactly which thing is which. It's an interesting space to be in now, because I think that everything that we've been struggling with over the last decade or so with social media is going to accelerate exponentially, potentially. I mean, and again, there's a scenario where things don't go wrong, and like, we do get proper safeguards in place for AI, and there is regulation that balances innovation with safety, which I think is very important. But I couldn't predict whether or not that happens at this point. But it is interesting to see how people are viewing these things, especially younger people who, they know it's coming, they know it's here. They don't have like super strong opinions about one thing or the other. There is some skepticism, I think, about AI in general and social media. It's just like, how does that translate then into behavior? And if it doesn't translate into behavior, then, we kind of maintain the status quo, which is, these things are going to continue to grow and go where the users and the attention are, fortunately or unfortunately. So that's kind of an interesting thing, that we're looking at. So, I mean, it's a great future, but also kind of a scary future. I mean, who knows? Like, it's all the possibilities are endless.
They sure are. Do you have any books that you might recommend for the listeners to dig in a little bit on these topics?
There's one, I don't remember the author. I believe it's called Surveillance Capitalism. It's a pretty dense read.
I have that book. That's a good book.
Very good book. I mean, that kind of just gets into the whole, like, what makes this economy, this sort of attention economy tick.
How might people find you?
Sure. So we're on LinkedIn primarily. LinkedIn, you can just type in Publitics. So that's Publitics, and you'll find us there. On Twitter as well, probably a little bit less active there. Facebook, Instagram. So we're on all the major platforms there. And then additionally, we're starting to populate our sort of newsletter blog a little bit more, called Influence IQ, which is influenceiq.publitics.com. We're going to be posting that AI data shortly. We've done a bunch of research in the clean energy space as well. So, like, we post, ideas, research, strategy, all of those interesting things. What are interesting to me, I'm not sure to anyone else, but like, I'm a complete nerd about it. So, That's what makes me tick anyway. So
that's exactly how I run Hey Human. These conversations I have may not be for everyone, but they certainly fascinate me, and I'm the one sitting here. So,
that's great.
Matthew, I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. It's fascinating. There's so much to talk about, and I would happily eat up your entire day talking about it. You have an open door if you ever want to come back and be on the show. I welcome that for sure.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and absolutely will take you back up on that. For sure.
Yeah. And thank you for listening, everybody. Bye.
This is great. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Rate and review and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks. Bye.